Hello friends, it's the Stitches. Today I want to share a slightly bigger sewing project that I recently made. I've been really trying to use up my existing fabric stash, so I made a pair of bloomers out of this pastel blue gingham that I bought as a remnant last fall. Given it's almost fall again now, I figured I should find a way to utilize it. Since blue is a major part of my Lolita fashion color scheme, I wanted to make something that I could use with the clothes from that particular part of my wardrobe. So I decided to make a pair of bloomers that could be worn under dresses or on their own as shorts. First, I started with a slightly altered version of my personal bloomers pattern. My personal pattern is an alteration of an alteration, and despite how many times people have asked, I just don't have the ability to scan and share my personal patterns at the moment. So I'll put some similar patterns in the description that are either free to print or from indie pattern makers for a low cost. That way you can make something similar for yourself if you want. But my original pattern was a bit too wide for my fabric, so I made yet another version that's just a little bit narrower. Since I have limited fabric, and also because I was just feeling lazy, I didn't match my print. I know unmatched stripes and plaids and other similar prints bothers some people, and on fitted garments it feels a little bit more important, but I'm not too concerned about the gingham not matching up at the seams on a loose-fitting gathered garment. My pattern doesn't have seam allowance, and despite the fact that it would actually be pretty easy to redraw it with some allowance added, as I've mentioned in the past, I seem to be allergic to doing anything that would make my life easier. So using a seam gauge, or a hem gauge, or whatever you call these little rulers with the slidey bit on them, I measured and added some seam allowance. Then I cut out my fashion fabric with a rotary cutter. To save myself some time, I used my first fabric piece as a pattern to cut out my second piece. Remember when doing this that the two pieces should mirror each other, so one of these pieces of fabric needs to be flipped over first. Now because I want these bloomers to be able to function as shorts, I flatlined them with another piece of fabric. My gingham isn't particularly sheer, but it is fairly thin, and I wanted to give it a bit more substance. For this, I used some off-white fitted sheets. I always look for sheets that look like they've barely been used or in outright new condition. Not only does it reduce the risk of surprise stains, but worn fabric isn't exactly ideal. To flatline my gingham pieces, I pinned it right side up to the lining fabric. The lining fabric should be right side down so that the wrong sides are together. Then the pins are placed 1 inch to 1.5 inches or so apart. I was also being pretty aggressive with my little DIY fabric weights, which are just washers from the hardware store that have been glued together with 2-part epoxy. Much more effective than the combination of coin banks and other random objects from around the craft room that I was using before. Once the fabric was fully pinned, I used the rotary cutter again and cut it out. Here's a close-up of the pinned edge. To bind my pieces, I first stitched them together on the sewing machine. The stitching line was in the approximate middle of the seam allowance. It can be anywhere inside the seam allowance as long as there's still room for serging. Next, I took my pieces over to the serger and finished the edges. Now this should behave like one solid piece of fabric. To finish my serging, because I wasn't feeling too lazy to do it for once, I threaded the serger tails through a tapestry needle and used it to tuck the tail into the thread loops to secure 1 inch or 2 of the tail. The excess can then be cut off. Time to actually assemble the bloomers. Since I only had 2 pattern pieces, I only had a couple seams to stitch up. The first of these is the leg seam, because I personally find it easier to do everything else once the legs are vaguely tube-shaped. Each piece folds over, fashion fabric on the inside, and the 2 little straight bits at the sides are pinned together. The curvy bit is left alone. That eventually becomes the crotch seam. Then I secured the seam with a basic straight stitch. As is standard practice, I pressed the seam allowance open. And I'm still mildly embarrassed by the embroidery transfer that I was way too aggressive with and is now just permanently on my ironing table. Next, I wanted to hem my legs with some lace, so I pulled out my box of embellishments. Most of these were thrifted, but I do have some bits of lace that came from independent shops or were being clearanced out from my local fabric store, so I picked them up really cheap. Some handmade pieces, just wherever I can find passable quality lace for a decent price. I keep my laces wrapped around some cards that I cut from the bit of paperboard that was left over from finishing a pad of watercolor paper for storage, because for some reason that's always the best quality paperboard. I don't know if people still hate Rachel lace in the Lolita community, because as a general rule I avoid the online community. They probably do, but these particular laces are pretty soft and aren't too stiff. I think a lot of people online forget that not all Rachel lace is created equal. I stitched my first piece of lace along the hemline. This first needed to be secured with the lace pointed upwards, right side down onto the fashion side of my fabric. After it's stitched, the lace is flipped down with the seam allowance at the hemline ironed up. This method is sometimes called lace hemming. Since my fabric is already finished along the edges, I don't have to double fold it. I like to iron on both sides to make sure everything is pressed down into place thoroughly. Then back at the sewing machine, I stitched the seam allowance down to finish the hem. Since I was stitching through several layers of fabric and one of them apparently had a thread count that was a bit too high, which is another thing you have to be careful about when you sew with sheets, I had a little bit of an issue with skip stitches when sewing through the side seam. This was fixed by increasing my stitch length a bit and using the slowest speed setting. I know not every machine has speed settings, so if you ever have the same issue, just stitch as slowly as possible. And also try not to buy sheets that have a super high thread count for sewing. My lace was clearly much longer at some point, but the original owner seems to have cut off the bottom to use that part for a project, and they left some of the excess netting, so I just used a small pair of scissors to carefully trim it away. Now the hem is finished, but I still want a little bit more lace on my leg pieces.
But first, we'll take a quick commercial break.
Using a seam gauge again, I pinned some scalloped lace not quite an inch above the hemline. I secured this with a line of stitching at both the top and bottom of this piece of lace. Ideally, I should have used some white thread for this, but I don't actually have any at the moment, at least thread that isn't in the form of a serger cone, and I have a lot of decades-old inherited thread that I'm trying to use up, so I just used the same 90s era blue thread I was using for the rest of this project. Luckily, the seam line isn't that noticeable on the finished garment. Next, I took some of the leftover sheet fabric to cut pieces for my elastic casing. First, I cut a long strip that was 4 inches by whatever the circumference of my leg pieces was, plus a couple inches. I don't remember the exact width that I cut this piece to, but it hardly matters since no one else will be using quite the same pattern. Then I cut this strip into 2 strips that were 2 inches wide by the length of my leg circumference. I took these pieces over to the serger and finished the edges, which is technically optional, but I did it anyway. Then I once again ironed them flat. You'll notice one of my strips isn't serged on one edge because there was a selvage there, so it's already technically finished. After finishing off my serger tails, I turned under the long edges and thoroughly pressed them down. This made a nice clean looking casing on the inside of the garment. The next step was to pin the casing down just above the lace on my leg pieces. I secured my casing half an inch above the uppermost stitch line, measuring with my seam gauge. At the sewing machine, I stitched my casing close to the edge on both the top and bottom, much like I did with the lace. The only difference is that the lace was secured on the right side of the fabric, and the casing is secured on the wrong side of the fabric, inside the garment. Once the casing was stitched into place, I cut 2 pieces of 3/4 inch elastic, the approximate width of my thighs at about where the bloomers will fall. This doesn't have to be exact. To thread the elastic through the casing, I left an opening at the seam line. I don't really like using bodkins with thick elastic like this, so instead I used a locking safety pin. I got this one in a set of 4 at Daiso a few years back. I'm sure there are some online as well. I secured the ends of the elastic together with a wide zigzag, stitching back and forth several times. To evenly distribute the gathering, I just pulled the leg and, I don't know, fiddled with it would be the best description, I suppose. Just pull it and release it a few times and the elastic will naturally fall into place in the casing. And here's a finished leg piece. Then finally, it was time to pin together the crotch. I used the leg seams and my pattern markings as a guide to pin my 2 leg pieces right sides together. Just like the leg seam, I secured the crotch seam with a basic straight stitch. And then I pressed open the seam allowance. To assist with this step, I used my tiny little pressing ham that I made entirely out of fabric scraps. The end of this project is almost in sight. Along the waistline, I turned 1.5 inches of the fabric to the inside of the garment and pressed it down to create another casing line for the waistband and pinned it in place. To secure the casing, I stitched close to the serged edge, leaving a gap at the back of the garment for the elastic to be threaded in. And once again, using a locking safety pin, I threaded in a piece of 3/4 inch elastic that was roughly the length of my waist measurement. Then I crossed the ends of the elastic and secured them on the sewing machine, again using a wide zigzag stitch and going back and forth a few times. The very last step is to close off the little gap in the casing. This left me with a finished pair of bloomers. While the normal purpose of bloomers is to be worn under wide skirts and petticoats for wind-related modesty reasons, I instead wanted to show you a couple outfits where I wore the bloomers as shorts in order to showcase them better. For my first look, I combined the bloomers with my Baby the Starshine Bright blouse, because of course I did, and this absolutely amazing sweater vest that I found on Depop for a surprisingly affordable price for a vintage piece like this. For accessories, I have these lace-topped knee-highs, also Baby the Starshine Bright, which I've managed to keep in my wardrobe for like 10 years now, and a vintage silk scarf that I picked up for $1 at what used to be my favorite thrift store, but let's just say you will no longer be finding anything there for $1. Regardless, this has quickly become one of my favorite outfits I've ever put together. The gingham with the florals reminds me of a garden picnic, except I am the picnic. My second look is a bit more casual. I've paired the bloomers with a secondhand Angelic Pretty Cutso and the same pair of socks from before. Overall, it's just a very comfortable look, and I'm all about comfort these days. I'm just completely over outfits that look nice but don't feel nice to actually wear. I also just feel like casual outfits in the Lolita and like Lolita adjacent fashions have been completely missing for a long time. Maybe I'm just not looking in the right places, but when I first got into this type of style in the later years of the early 2000s, casual Lolita and bloomer outfits were a lot more popular. Clearly I am a bloomer fanatic, so it is my obvious opinion that we should really bring them back. That's all I have to show you today. I really like how these bloomers came out. I'm always happy when I can use up some of my fabric stash and clear space in my craft room. I'm trying to get better about only buying materials when I have an actual need for them, but the sweet siren call of the remnant bins still gets me from time to time. It's also hard to resist getting stuff from thrift stores when you know you will probably eventually use it and you know you won't be able to come back for it later. But as the sewing sections at my local thrift stores have slowly started to disappear, maybe that won't be as much of an issue for me in the future. I hope this was able to give you some inspiration to work on your own fabric stashes, or was just interesting to watch for you non-sewers in the audience. And with that, I hope everyone has a good day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!